Hello, today we will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the New Zealand economy. We will talk about basic information of New Zealand and then one containment policy and two economic rescue policy. Three equation model will be used to analyze impact, and we will finish with a summary. In 2018, New Zealand tourism contributed 6.1% of its GDP, which was damaged during the pandemic. The total value of import and export account for 56% of GDP. Its import was greatly reduced during the pandemic, but its export remained at a stable level, which is one of the reasons why the New Zealand economy can recover rapidly. The first case of COVID-19 in the New Zealand occurred on February 28, 2020, about 1 month later than most of the country, including the US and UK. This provides the New Zealand government with sufficient time to formulate effective response policy. To the end of January 2022, there are around 16,000 confirmed cases, account for 0.3% of its total population, and there are only 52 deaths, which is the lowest death rate around the world. About the economy indicator, New Zealand quarterly GDP growth remained at a positive level before, and in the second quarter of 2020, with the outbreak of pandemic, GDP experienced a brief decline, but rebounded rapidly in the following quarter. Its CPI index, a measure of inflation, remained around 2% in 2019. At the beginning of 2020, due to the shutdown of international trade, the import was greatly reduced, while its consumption level was not lowered so much due to the policy stimulus, and there was a temporary increase in the CPI index. New Zealand unemployment rate remained at a very low level, 4% before, and there was an increase in the early 2020. But with the economic rescue policy, the employment rate recovered rapidly. Next, we will discuss about the New Zealand containment policy and economic rescue policy. The COVID-19 alert system was proposed on March 21, 2020. The system has 4 levels in total: repair, reduce, restrict, and lockdown. According to the real-time pandemic, the government adjusted the alert level, and at the highest level, level 4, all residents must stay at home and no gathering allowed, so resulting in low consumption. Business must close except for necessity and therefore reduce the production. In addition, the entire tourism industry in New Zealand closed temporarily. The figure on the right shows the number of new cases every day. There are 2 small peaks occur in the late March 2020 and August 2021. During these 2 periods, to prevent community transmission, the alert level was adjusted to level 4. And we can see that at the end of 2021, the number of cases shows an increasing trend. This is because New Zealand changed its target from elimination of COVID to the minimization and protection.
As part of the fiscal policy, the wage subsidy policy is highly related to the COVID alert level. On the slide, you can see the first row is all COVID policies, and the second row are all wage subsidy policies. The first wage subsidies policy starts on March 17, 2020. The New Zealand government announced a 12.1 billion package, represents 4% of its GDP, including 5.1 billion in wage subsidies for affected business in all sectors and regions, and another 2.8 billion in business tax changes to free up cash flow, and total 8.7 billion in support for business and jobs. This round ends in June and was replaced by a scheme with stricter requirements. There were also 2 rounds of wage subsidy in 2021 in March and September separately. As we can see, almost every subsidy scheme starts with a level up of COVID alert level, and the government uses different schemes to achieve a focus on subsidizing more severely damaged business. So from the outcomes perspective, the wage subsidy is proven to be quite efficient in preventing mass output loss and in unemployment. Although the labor productivity slightly drops in 2020, the real minimum wage increases. And this graph on the right is the growth rate calculated using 2 different adjustments. We can see that the wage keeps a growing trend even during the COVID-19. And as we have introduced before, the unemployment rate remains at a low level. The wage subsidy also covers the majority of the workforce, which can reflect its effectiveness as well. Therefore, the wage subsidy policy contributes to keep the income stable and increase domestic consumption.
So from a monetary policy standpoint, the first step introduced by the New Zealand government was to reduce the official cash rate from 1 to 0.25%, and they announced that it would be maintained this way at this level for 12 months. It was actually set a little bit longer, around 18 months, and after October 2021, the OCR rose rapidly. But since the interest rates were already low, the government decided to implement the large-scale asset purchases program, LSAP, which is a quantitative easing scheme designed to repurchase government bonds in order to reduce their yield. Due to this lower rate of return, investors are not looking for government bonds, but for other financial assets to invest their funds, assets that could have been avoided without the measure. This has a positive effect for households and consumption since the interest rates are maintained low, especially for loans or mortgages. The LSAP program was expanded several times, but it ended up in July 23rd for an amount of 55 billion of government bonds repurchased, which is half of what was announced at some point of the number of 100 billion. So from so now let's see how this policy has impacted the real economy. So the low official cash rate and the QE were implemented as well with other policies such as macro relaxation in macroprudential regulation to ease loans and mortgages. So on this graph, we see in green the amount of government bonds repurchased. In blue are the government bonds yields for 5 years and 10 years, and in red is the low overnight interbank cash rate. So we can see that there's kind of a correlation with the amount of government bonds repurchased and the low yield maintained at the time. Especially, we can see that once the LSAP program was ended, the yield started going up again. So we can say that these measures were successful in increasing investment and consumption and reassuring confidence in the market and expectations.
For the three-equation model, we will be painting a picture of the cumulative effect of the policies that were introduced. We assume the economy starts at point A, where the real interest rate is R star, employment is in equilibrium where the PS and WS curves intersect, output is at its expected level, and inflation is at its target, so the central bank is at its bliss point. The shock of the pandemic would shift the IS curve to the left from IS0 to IS1, because, for example, many people may not want to leave their houses to consume. And you can imagine this would affect sectors like tourism, retail, and hospitality. And this would have a knock-on effect to inflation expectations, shifting the Phillips curve to the right. With the containment policy in New Zealand, they acted very decisively to shut the country down. And so many people would not be working. So there's the expectation that households' disposable incomes will fall. This means that the marginal propensity to consume will also fall. So households will also reduce their consumption as a result. This paired with increased uncertainty would shift the IS curve from the left from IS1 to IS2, moving the economy to point C, where output is much lower than the expected level. The result is a negative output gap with the WS and PS curves, which could lead to a deflationary spiral, lowering inflation expectations and shifting the PC curve further to the right, further away from the bliss point. We can assume that the government and central bank could foresee the impact of the containment policy. And so they had to act decisively to prevent a deflationary trap, which is where a negative aggregate demand shock can create a feedback loop that sends the economy into a downward spiral. So they introduced wage subsidies as part of their fiscal stimulus as a means of increased government spending to keep household consumption to at least 80% of its normal level. The result would be a rightward shift in the IS curve from IS2 to IS3. As there is still a negative output gap, inflation expectations will only change slightly, but will still shift the Phillips curve to the left. Therefore, after the containment policies and wage subsidy policies, the economy would be at point D, which is ultimately closer to the original equilibrium. With the monetary policy, one of the jobs of the central bank is to forecast where the Phillips curve will be at the end and set an interest rate that will help move inflation back to its target. The interest rate that they set will be dependent upon the intersection of the MR curve with the most recent Phillips curve, as this will help the central bank to lower their loss function. They select point E at pi4, which can then be traced up to the IS curve. Though this was not the only monetary stimulus provided. They also loosened credit constraints and engaged in quantitative easing through the LSAP scheme. Quantitative easing is particularly important because interest rates have a zero lower bound. So they did this to help maintain the low interest rates and increase the credit supply, which in turn increased consumption and investment. And this would shift the IS curve further to the right from IS3 to IS4. Though we believe that the economy would not return to its original IS curve because there was still a lot of uncertainty at this point. This means that the combined effect of all three policies would leave the economy at point E, where the real interest rate is R1, slightly below R star, because otherwise firms and households would not invest. And there's a positive output gap according to the WS and PS curves, which could lead to an inflationary spiral in the medium to long term. Inevitably, with these policies, there is a lag, especially with wages and prices because they are sticky. But we actually saw the number of people employed increase to record high levels and inflation rate fell to just below target levels. And we will elaborate on this later on in the presentation.
Overall, we see that owing to the combined effect of the fiscal stimulus package and the monetary policy, which includes lowering interest rates and extending credit, it results in a multiplier effect, which causes the IS curve to shift rightwards. This will cause the interest rate to fall to R2 and the output to increase to Y4. Thus, the higher inflation at the cost of growth will result in an inflation spiral in the weight setting curve. As is reflected in the Phillips curve, inflation and inflation expectations reach a level above pre-pandemic levels, thus reducing the value of real wages, and this could potentially shift the weight setting curve upwards. Moving on to the evolution of the main metrics, which includes GDP, unemployment, and inflation. New Zealand's economy shrank sharply in the second quarter of 2020 owing to the strict lockdown under Alert Level 4, which shut down businesses considered to be non-essential. However, early virus containment allowed many sectors, including construction, to reopen in late April under Alert Level 3, and most businesses had returned to full operation by June. The economy rebounded strongly, rising to 4.5% above the pre-COVID level by the second quarter of 2021, one of the strongest recoveries among OECD countries. At this point, economic growth had far exceeded the potential rate, which was 2.5%, quickly closing the output gap. However, tourism-related sectors such as transportation or accommodation had not recovered owing to the ongoing tight border restrictions. In terms of employment, the wage subsidy played a key role, particularly in protecting youth employment, according to a report by the IMF. This report further stated that the aftermath of the scheme being lifted could have potentially scarring and long-term impacts on the labor market. Another important facet to consider is inflation, which initially fell from March 2020 to March 2021 before it started to increase well above the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's 1 to 3% target band, reflecting large increases in both tradables and non-tradables inflation. Capacity constraints in trading partner economies have also contributed to the increase in tradables inflation, as have commodity price increases. Underlying inflation also increased to above the target band. Household and two-year business inflation expectations have also consequently increased. Overall, the OECD recommends that New Zealand should withdraw the fiscal stimulus rapidly to reduce the burden of macroeconomic stabilization on the monetary policy. Moreover, to tighten the monetary policy to the extent necessary to bring back inflation within the target band and to ensure that inflation expectations remain anchored. Thank you.